Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the tin drum of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka Limited Vinyl Drop from Tommy Wright III on Go to Warx.
Is that a rapper?
Yeah, old school Memphis stuff.
Country artist? All right.
Yeah.
and I am the black metal guy, aka Dreaming Pinch Harmonics.
Dreaming in little squealies.
I kid you not, I woke up with hearing Immolation riffs.
You listen to it that much, huh?
Like, I'd listened to it a bunch for the show, and like, just the music that was going through my head as I woke up was just Immolation riffs, and I swear there were fucking pinch harmonics.
Well, there's a lot of pinch harmonics in Immolation, so that makes sense.
There are, although this new record has fewer.
That's the gradients. That's how you rate an Immolation record. You
have to exactly. It's like Immolation records are all sort of sliders on things. Like, okay, this one has more pinch harmonics. Okay, this one is, more mid-tempo, right, or less mid-tempo. Anyway, we should talk about that second
when we actually get to it. Yeah. Let's see. So yeah, we don't have an intro segment this time, guys.
Yeah, we do.
But, well,
the people want to know your character in Elden Ring. The people who aren't on the Discord.
The people who want to know my character in Elden Ring.
One of our Danny Filth patrons who's not on the Discord specifically, but I'm sure that means everyone else wants to know.
Yeah. So I'm doing. I'm close to the end now. I'm doing a sort of blended strength dex build. I'm running. I forget the name of the weapon.
Quality build. That's what it's called.
Quality, yeah, I don't know. I haven't even fucked around with like the Ash of War, like quality versus force or whatever.
Quality is just the word for blended strength dex if you're using weapons that are about balanced at distribution.
Yeah, that's what I'm running.
So like a bastard sword or certain kinds of fast great swords would be quality, but not like the mega great swords.
Yeah. I'm not using any colossal weapons or anything. I'm actually doing, I forget the name of it specifically, but I'm using the one Frostbite Axe that you find in like an optional crypt, like a third to midway through the game. And
that sounds pretty sick.
Yeah, no, it's been doing really well for me. And I'm actually running old school, like Dark Souls 1 Axe and Shield.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah, I'm not, I haven't been, like, power stancing with double. I tried it a little bit early on, but it's kind of weird because of the FromSoft games, Bloodborne is my favorite, so I'm used to doing these very sort of aggressive builds. That's always where I felt comfortable. But for Elden Ring in particular, the shield felt like it had a lot more utility than people give it credit for. And so yeah, I've been playing kind of a balanced all-around character.
Yeah, I don't have a system, so I've been following it sort of remotely right now, just like listening to lore vids and watching some playthroughs, but not too much to spoil it. And
you're one of those like old guys that buys every new edition of Dungeons and Dragons, and not to play it, but to just argue with people about it. Yeah.
Well, that's me with Warhammer too. It's like I expect that I'm going to have a little more time to deal with things like this and a little more money shortly, but yeah, I'm gonna play Elden Ring. I just haven't had a chance yet, and it's what I've noticed is that I think this is sort of a consensus, is that, like, the game is clearly meant to be super anime in a way that's kind of fun, but like the core of the games should always be about just like basic mechanics of sword fighting,
Yeah.
Sword, shield, whatever other somewhat cooler weapon. But like, I feel like it's the power move to just have an axe and a shield.
old school Viking berserker shit. Yeah, no, it's I would say that like it feel like the moment to moment gameplay feels very comparable to the rest of the FromSoft titles. Stuff like Sekiro accepted, obviously, but. Yeah, no, I've just crossed the 100-hour threshold. I've had a really good time with it, but at this point, I'm pretty ready to wrap it up. I think in the next couple sessions, I'll probably be wrapping up. 100 hours is a lot of time to dedicate to a game when you're in your 30s,
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so Elden Ring discussion out of the way. Quick announcement for everybody. It is that time of year, and Terminus is about to go on summer vacation. It's our usual 2-week break in the middle of the year that has become a beloved tradition, for us at least. This seems to be the time of year where work gets really hot for both of us. In various ways. So yeah, after this episode, we're going to take 2 weeks off, and then we will be back in full force with the 100th episode, actually, of Terminus, and we're figuring out some ways to try and make that one special for everybody. So, a couple weeks off, and then we'll be back. But if you don't want it to end, there's a couple ways you can keep up with the goings-on while we're on our pseudo-vacation, which means we're just putting even more time into our, day jobs. Easiest way to do that is by following us on social media. Me, the Death Metal Guy, at Terminus Podcast on Facebook, and the Black Metal Guy on Instagram at Terminus Extreme Metal. And then, additionally, if you have to maintain the parasocial relationship, and the idea of not hearing our dulcet tones drives you further and further into a black chasm of sorrow and despair, the easiest way to ameliorate that deficiency in your spirit is by providing us with your money.
Damn, you're on fire tonight, little guy.
I don't know.
That's some S-tier shilling.
Yeah, man, I'm well practiced at this point. Yeah. But yeah, if you want to follow us during our break and beyond, $3 and up on Patreon gets you access to our Terminus Prime bonus episodes, as well as I haven't really showed the Terminus After Dark episodes, which is a more casual sit by the fire Joe Rogan kind of experience with the guys from Terminus.
The boundary between those and the formal bonus episodes is not totally clear.
It has blurred considerably. I guess,
yeah. There are moments when we randomly shit. Yeah, there are moments where we'll do like a half hour of just like verbal shit posting or whatever. But or mostly just complaining about metal.
Just bitching.
In the show, we try to be as positive as possible, and then afterwards we bitch. Yeah,
we just get negative as fuck about everything immediately.
We get extremely negative, But it was surprise. We hate everything. But yeah, it's really, it is like some like metal dad shit.
Oh god.
But anyway, yeah. Also, I thought of another thing, another patron benefit, kind of, is just like, we occasionally just ask them for tips, right? Like this week, I was just like, I cannot find a fucking record. Somebody recommends some black metal albums. And they did. But I ultimately went with mine.
You ultimately took none of their advice into account.
But I have in the past. And certainly people who are patrons give us tips about things all the time. Like, send us shit.
Well, I mean, shit, half the time they end up, posting the records we cover in the intervening period between us recording and posting. Like, they already know what we're going to cover.
That's very true.
Yeah. But anyway, as I was saying, so $3 and up gets you access to those bonus episodes, and $5 and up gets you access to the Terminus Black Circle, our private Discord server where we can, share Ranny from Elden Ring Rule 34 and talk about our favorite gore noise demos. So it's a good time. It's a good time all around. But we gotta wrap up this half season. So let's talk about fucking music.
Hail! This is Brandon from Cromlech, and you're listening to Terminus.
Alright, so I know all of you heard the intro, you're all excited for our thoughts on the big record, but that comes later. You have to eat your vegetables before you get your dessert. And your vegetables in this case, though, are pretty good. They're like a properly roasted Brussels sprout or something. In this case, we have the newest record by Melancholy Pessimism, titled Shut Up, Give Up, and Obey, out now on Bizarre Leprous production. Melancholy Pessimism is a surprisingly unknown band. They are a Czech deathgrind band who have been around in some form or another since 1992, but really haven't gotten much attention outside of, Czechia itself and really dedicated Eastern European deathgrind guys. There was a period of time where the whole Czech grind scene was like pretty popular in the 2000s. There was kind of a fad for a few years where it was super hot. But even during that time, nobody really talked about Melancholy Pessimism. But they've got this really long established pedigree in that scene. So I've heard some of the band's older records, and they've always been a really solid death grind band that tended to have kind of an experimental streak. Every album focused on kind of different ideas. They'd play around with some ideas outside of metal in a lot of cases, and it was always just really, really good and interesting music. But now we're back with their, let's see, seventh full-length record. Oh, hold on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8. Yeah, that is the 8th full-length record. And it's going to be a little bit different. So there was a gap between 2010 and 2019 where they weren't producing anything. And it looks like there was a huge lineup switch. The only original member now is the vocalist. So it's almost like a new band. However, in keeping with the spirit that's been established on prior records. So I was really interested to see your reaction to this, and you ended up actually really liking it, which kind of surprised me, because this is very, I think this doesn't really do a lot of the things you typically look for in death metal, but I'm interested in what about it appeals to you so much.
Well, what are the things I look for in death metal?
Well, I think, we'll talk about that on the next review, to a degree. But I do think you are attracted to death metal that kind of, in a sense, does black metal things in a different way. I think that you like... I think one of the big things that you look for in death metal is... a specific kind of melodic arrangement that you don't typically get in black metal. I think that to a degree you look for technical performance as a component of it, just because that's such a distinct feature of death metal, kind of distinguishing it from black metal at the most basic level.
Look for the distinguishing features. Yeah.
But
you have to remember, I also like grave.
Yeah, that's true.
And so, in a sense, you could say that's doing things like black metal, and then it has 4 riffs and it's retarded. But it's the other side of it is so there's something where I go to death metal for these a very different articulation of certain kinds of moods that aren't foreign to the black metal universe. But on the other hand, I tend to listen to death metal as hardcore, right? That's the other thing.
I was about to say that's the other idea, is you listen to a lot of death metal that sort of does things that hardcore does.
And this is, often better than hardcore, But this is a case of a... Yeah, I don't know. I just think of this as a grind record. And it's a really thrashy kind of death grind record. It seems... some of the Eastern European stuff, this is just an overall impression, I couldn't give you an example, but some of the Eastern European stuff, even when it's good, is simultaneously a little too crusty and a little too clean.
Mm-hmm.
Like the things off of Self-Made God where I'm more kind of like, hey, yeah, this is cool, right? Some of the stuff on there I really like, right? But some of it, it's just more like, okay, this is solid, right?
Very sort of clean, modern grind ideas.
Yeah, modern grind with sort of sort of chunky MIDI crust riffs that are unremarkable in themselves. Mm-hmm. The really good crust grind is often extreme, either sort of stenchy and filthy or really raw. There's a Polish band called Wojtyla or something, just Tyl. I don't know. I don't fucking know. It ends with an A. But that I like a lot. But So I like this because it certainly has the punk underpinnings of grindcore there. They haven't forgotten about that. But it really does what I think the best grind should, which, as we say, is grinds.
Yeah.
Both in terms of just having this relentless internal momentum, but also deliberately drawing, no particular stylistic move is off the table. Right? Mm-hmm. Every kind of riff, there's no such thing as a grind riff, with certain exceptions, as we found out. But, like, almost every, it's like grab bag riffing, and the grab bag riffing on this it all sounds really modern, but it's structured like thrash for a lot of it. But a lot of the chords and tones sound like sort of modern abrasive death metal or beatdown.
I agree.
Or even like just not really slam per se, although there are slams on here, but more like a brutal death tone to some degree. So it's got a cool thing where it works. It really does work like grind, but it's making the most out of various kinds of modern extremity, and it is not excessively polished, in part because the production has some rough edge to it, but more than that, because it uses sort of like ugly chords and really high-pitched, really high-paced chugging and sorts of just like vicious patterns that you can really only get out of death and thrash technique.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said. I would say that the Czech grind scene, I use that as a very broad term. Mm-hmm. So when I mean that, I mean sort of a juxtaposition of like death metal and grindcore and sort of metallic crust and some other stuff. Over in the Czech scene, all that stuff kind of floats together. There isn't nearly as much distinction between sort of like crusty hardcore scenes and metal scenes, as far as I've seen. And everything over there is going to incorporate all of those influences, but it's typically going to lean in one direction or another a little bit more. And Melancholy Pessimism traditionally definitely leans very heavily in the death metal direction. So to talk about this in relation to the rest of their discography, I know that you're not familiar with the earlier stuff, but one of the important things is this doesn't really have the outside of metal influence that a lot of their records typically do. The Czech grind scene always had a reputation for being very experimental, especially in its heyday. And there were moments where that resulted in really great stuff, and there were moments where it just got kind of goofy. And I think that Melancholy Pessimism mostly stayed on the side of just having cool, very weird ideas. It's like, oh, how do we make a saxophone work in the breakdown of this one song? And I think that's what kind of made them cool, was something that we'll also notice as we go through this record and we start covering samples. There's definitely a sense of individual songs being able to have individual singular components, and it doesn't need to be a thing necessarily applied to all the other songs. I gotta come up with a better term for that. That's something I've talked about on the show before. The idea of, let's say on a black metal record there is one song with clean vocals. They don't need a clean vocalist for the whole album. They allow the statement to stand on its own on a single track. Which is something Melancholy Pessimism always did, and here it still happens, it's just a lot more subtle. So I think that this is definitely like a sort of deep cut death metal record for people who just have a ton of like death and grind experience. And in some ways it's almost parallel to something like the Corpus Christi record we covered, where you don't...
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, you don't really get the rhetorical you. You don't really get the all the nuances of this until you've just listened to tons and tons of records. And then you start to realize, oh, these are guys with, even though this is a newer lineup, like at least closer to 3 decades of experience playing death and grind between them. They know songwriting tricks that are just the result of tons of practice and jamming. And so... go ahead.
The other crucial thing is that it sounds... I mean, I guess I was kind of saying this without saying it before. It's like unlike many other old bands, it sounds like they still they keep up with, not just with grind or death metal, but with everything.
Yeah, and I think
they listen to music that was released in the last 10 years and like it and incorporate into their sound.
Yeah, and I think that's a component that we've noticed, especially from like older bands, which at first blush you can imagine, okay, these guys are probably approaching 50, they've got the music that they grew up on, maybe they've gotten stuck on it. But I think over the course of a couple years on the show, we've really noticed that the coolest bands of guys who are getting a little bit longer in the tooth, just in terms of what you would imagine a metalhead to be, are the guys who have that firm understanding of what made old school metal so great, but have not decided that's the be-all, end-all of it.
Yeah, well, that was true with Corpus Christi, too, right?
Yes.
Both, it sounded extremely sleek and modern, but, not even in a way that would be current today, in a way that would have been current 10 years ago. In this weird way. But, none of the basic things that were done on the Corpus Christi record were alien at all to the fundamental vocabulary of second wave BM, right? That they would pass the Euronymous test with flying colors. You'd be like, production's too nice, but, this is good. If you... And I think same with this Melancholy Pessimism, it doesn't do anything different from early 90s death thrash. It just does it with different parts and different tones, different parts, a way greater range of styles to draw from.
Yeah, and it naturally incorporates sort of technological advancements that if they were available in 93, everybody would fucking do.
Yeah.
I'll get into that in detail on certain samples.
Hey, use that pedal that makes it sound cold and harsh.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, speaking of which, let's listen to music. I think you've got the first one this time.
Yeah. So, this is 6 Steps from Disgust to Attraction.
I almost sampled this one. This is a really good one.
Oh, it's fantastic. So this is a kind of a song within a song structure. It's longer than you might expect for something like this, right? That longer songs can, not like a minute and a half, give this something in common with death metal. But this is the 3rd track on the record, and yeah, you're getting this interesting song within a song. We're going to come in one riff into the inner song, and so starting on the 2nd riff, and I regret to inform you, the lyric is not Jesus was a eunuch, but I will forever hear it that way.
I'm really glad you sampled that section. That was I thought about sampling that on my first listen, and then there was just other stuff I wanted to draw attention to, but I'm very glad you got that part.
Yeah, man. So, lot to talk about there, but especially, I mean, obviously the vocal line jumps out as really catchy, but really let's talk about the core riffing. At the end, you've got and there's like an initial blasting sequence that goes into a thrash riff, and I heard you say, that's a good thrash riff.
Yeah.
And that's the riff that was playing at the end, right? This is a great example of what we were talking about. Structurally, that could be a Slayer riff. It could almost be on Kill 'Em All. It's just a thrash riff. However, it's being played with, they're using this sort of very modern tone, and it's being played with skronk chords. I think they're just like doing that thing where instead of a power chord, you play a tritone and you just slide it all the way up. But the way they're doing that, it sounds like fucking Skin Chamber or something. Like that's like the Skin Chamber slide riff. And it sounds like a lot of something you would hear in more recent beatdown or, kind of like heavy music with a real just nasty industrial edge to it. It's one of those, and it works when they're playing it with that kind of chord and phrasing it in this way. It's phrased in just a much more heavy way than it could be if you were playing that as throwback thrash or black thrash or whatever. And it's the heavier tone helps, the more low end. But the way they're playing it with that skronk chord is the skronk chords it works like one of those shotgun cocking riffs, right?
Yeah,
you get to the end of the riff and you cock the shotgun.
The charge,
which we hear on, you can trace that all the way back to Winter, who will come up again in this review, but, or to Bolt Thrower. But it's really exaggerated on a lot of new stuff that is just crushing a down tempo, right? Like Fluids has those.
Yeah. What I think is really interesting about this part is the idea that, and this is something that recurs throughout the record, it's sort of like all of these riffs are, in a sense, the same riff, just played with different inflections of genre. Like when you break into that thrash riff, they do a modification of it, which is like the hardcore take on it. And then getting back to one of my original the idea of, isolated moments or elements of songs, the sort of like half-sung vocal passage in this is the only time on the album that happens, I believe.
Those are awesome. And the other cool thing is I think they're not on the root note. They're sort of suspended.
Yeah, there's an odd sort of harmonization going on there. It's like very
straining up, kind of bellowing. It's a little like a Killing Joke vocal, but really sounds very, very faithfully thrashy.
I think it's probably specifically from like early Strapping Young Lad. Of all things, yeah. But given their kind of experimental penchant, I could see them being really into that.
Interesting. I mean, probably also a bit like Carnivore in that.
Oh yeah.
Vocals kind of blown out and way to the front. I don't think it really works in the mix in Carnivore, which is one of those bands that should be like one of my favorite bands, but just has never clicked for me.
Really? That's interesting.
I'll give it, I give it a try every once in a while, but,
Retaliation's very good. Yeah.
Yeah. It's, I mean, in concept, I fucking love it, right? But,
yeah.
It's kind of like that Agnostic Front record that Pete Steele wrote, too. Like, it's a solid record, but it's basically just crossover, right?
Yeah, I feel you.
You want it to be just really thuggish and vicious and, like, metallic, and it's really not. But or you want it to sound like Oi, too, and it doesn't. But you want it to be like the thrash Oi Holy Grail. But yeah, so this is, this, though, so it's maybe got a bit of that, like, okay, sort of flamboyant frontman thrash thing, right? Whether it's, Devin Townsend or Pete Steele. But the other thing would be, to talk about there, is the detail and the breakdown.
Yeah.
So the breakdown, it's sort of, it's derived from the main chug riff. But the reason they're able to play that breakdown so many times is because it's actually a 4-rep sequence. And it's A, B, C, D. Each part of the sequence has a different turnaround. And in a breakdown riff like that, the turnaround is the thing that gives it its character, right? So each one has a different one, and I think they repeat, like, they do 12 times. They do 3 of 4, and then come back in, something like that. And it's, that's that kind of, like, sign of a master kind of thing, right? There are younger bands who do things like that, but that attention to detail is really characteristic of people who've been around the block, and who are no longer just sort of, you know, a lot of younger bands who are playing these kinds of, like, uglier down-tempo sounds are just really invested in the novelty of the sound itself.
Yeah.
And these guys are jaded enough that they're like, okay, yeah, this down-tune shit is cool, but, like, let's make these sick thrash riffs, man.
Yeah, what are we
Like,
gonna do with this sound?
riffs.
Yeah.
What are we gonna do with this sound? And they know what makes they know what a slam and what a beatdown is, as we'll hear in my next sample. But they know all that, but they also remember what makes that those are derived from the breakdown. So what makes a good breakdown?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'll hear a lot of those kind of nested breakdown structures across this record. There's parts of this record that are insanely fast, but a lot of this just kind of operates at like an upper mid-tempo, a very confident kind of upper mid-tempo. So let's get to actually the very next track on the record. I think that Six Steps is where the record really takes off. First couple songs are solid, but they didn't really grab me. That, like you, I think that's the one where it's like, okay, here's where we're really getting going. So the very next song, Pandemic Corruption, is one of the shorter tracks.
For information on the COVID pandemic, please see this helpful link from the CDC.
Exactly. Well, that is an interesting thing to note. Melancholy Pessimism has always been like stridently political, but not in the way that a lot of people might imagine that. It's more just like extremely anti-authoritarian and just suspicious. It was like when we talked about the committee way back in the day. Mm-hmm. It's that same philosophy of just pure suspicion of anybody in power ever.
And it's sort of like actual anarchy.
Yeah,
absolute anarchy, not moralized or democratic anarchy. You just fucking get away from me. I've got a shotgun.
Exactly. Yeah, and they're really into that. Yeah. So, Pandemic Corruption. This is a really cool example of where I think this record really succeeds, which is on a structural level. So, a lot of these songs are based around very specific kind of cellular guitar motifs that are used to direct the flow of the song. So here on Pandemic Corruption, you're going to hear this very needling sort of, G-string ascending...
the needling G-string.
The needling G-string. The sort of ascending cryptopsy type figure. And that is going to be used over and over again as a signpost for abrupt switches in the feel and the direction of the song. So a lot of stuff happens on these songs. There's just a ton of parts that don't really seem distinct from each other immediately.
That was a lot of riffs.
That's a lot of riffs that are all kind of similar. They're all in, like, the same general worlds, but they have an agglutinative effect of, adding up to a kind of narrative structure.
Absolutely.
But you'll hear that that sort of keening, deliberately obnoxious sort of cryptopsy riff is used as the signpost for, like, multiple transitions throughout the entire song.
The sort of like...
Yeah, that one. Yeah. It pops up. It'll be arranged different harmonically. It will be played different numbers of times. There will be little alterations in the exact intervals and stuff, but you always recognize, okay, this is an indicator of, like, a big switch that's about to happen. It's really interesting. It's an interesting songwriting conceit, and you'll hear that a lot across the record. So much of this is based off a very traditional sort of death metal philosophy of, like, big whiplash changes in melodic ideas and rhythmic ideas. But you know what they do? Melancholy Pessimism uses those kind of signpost riffs, if we want to call them that, in the place where other people would, like, drop the drums, do solo guitar to introduce a new riff. Instead, they weave it into these little fill structures that slot in organically and provide this nice bridging texture into an idea that's, like, dramatically different. It's almost a sort of classical philosophy in a way. I just think it's really interesting. It's one of those subtleties that elevates this record, because I think we both agree that this is not a record that's really about big riffs. I don't think it doesn't typically have, huge moments from riff to riff. The real pleasure of this record is kind of unraveling these elaborate songs.
Yeah, although I would say it riffs exactly in the way music like this should. It's just full of really good, like we talk about the cult of the good D-beat riff, right? And you can, like the first Discharge records, Discharge themselves and a few other of the very best D-beat bands actually have riff-focused D-beat records, as in, like, there's 2 riffs per song, and they're extremely memorable. But, like, most... Like, a lot of music like this just relies on really well-written attack riffs, just aggressive rhythm guitar. And I think this band has it in spades. And it's in part because they're making use of all this thrash vocabulary. I think that's something I've been on all over this year, is just like...
good use of thrash vocabulary.
Like, I agree with you that, thrash metal for the most part sucked, right? But thrash, right? Maybe thrash metal, not so much, but thrash as an idea, right? Perfected by the craziest thrash bands. That is something worth carrying forward, and you can carry it forward into all sorts of genre contexts, right?
Yeah.
So, like, here, we hear it in brutal and tech death, right? We hear it, in certain kinds of black metal in interesting ways, and here we're hearing it in deathgrind. A band that's on the brain for me, because I've been listening to them a lot. That I just fucking love them, is Ares Kingdom, right? That is like one of the heaviest. I would, like, put that tied with Solstice for, like, best heavy metal record ever, or whatever, or, like, best. It may be the best thrash metal record ever, after, like, fucking, Slayer or whatever. It's just, like, that is thrashy, but it has nothing to do with thrash metal. And the way that this band has these, like, super... Well, nothing to do is an overstatement. But the way this band has, like... The way Melancholy Pessimism has this kind of, like, they play these chug riffs, but just in it, like, they make them better in all these obvious ways. Like, just, like, tune it lower. Use a more crushing guitar sound. Play better riffs that aren't all in sort of just, like, harmonic minor or whatever, right? I don't know. It's good to hear stuff like this.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think what you're getting at is just a sort of, like, really impressive broad spectrum understanding the evolution of death metal and the right time and place to go back in time and use those originating ideas without turning it into just a tribute to the old school, man. You know, to use those ideas to make something like genuinely kind of new and compelling. So I'm going to get to my next sample, which is toward the end of the record. It's Pyramidal Power, which I assume is like an anti-Illuminati song, given the album art and everything. So a really distinguishing feature about this record is an outstanding drum performance. It is never overstated, but if you're listening closely, you'll find a ton of subtlety, a wonderful sense of groove. It's very musical drumming in general. And I guess just as kind of like a side note, I really love the way this record uses gravity blasts as like a primary drum figure. Because that was one of the things that I was thinking of, is like the idea of technological advancements that we would have used in 93.
Yeah.
Why the fuck? Everyone would have been using gravity blasts. It's like a blast beat, but it's faster. Yes.
That's a really good criterion for progress in everything. It's like, you know, there's a lot of shit going on today that a Viking would have made Vikings laugh or cry. But if you had showed them, like, a pickup truck, they would have been like, this is fucking sick. Right?
Yeah. You show them a solid Tacoma, they're like, yeah, this seems like a vehicle of Odin. But yeah, it's like that's actually something I've always been curious about, is like, why has the gravity blast as a drum figure been relegated to
we talked about this with Holocausto Cannibal. I was saying that, like, why don't they all fucking do this, right? Because that's pretty straightforward. That's like more both, it's more clean and more crushing, right? It's not like thrashy. It's not in this sort of thrashy tradition, right? That's just like hyper fast, hyper slow death grind. And the gravity blasts there, I just wish they did them the whole album.
Yeah, it's like...
I understand that you can have different... You don't need just gravity blasts. It's better if there are not. If it's not, so you can crank up and down. But the... Yeah, I completely agree. Why... The tools are there. Why not use them?
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's a technique that should just be fundamental to death metal. You know?
If you want to think about a technique that's fundamental to the idea of grinding, what distinguishes grind? Is it like a gravity blast? Blast beats don't have to inherently grind. A gravity blast inherently grinds.
Yes.
If you're playing a gravity blast in any way that doesn't grind, you're playing early 2000s tech death, and you should stop.
Exactly. So Pyramidal Power, we're going to go to the beginning of the track. I love the intro section's drumming, and it's a motif that comes up repeatedly throughout the song. This wonderful sort of like drunken blast beat with these quick snapping, like rolling fills in the middle of it on the snare. It sounds fucking awesome. It's actually a relatively simple kind of 4/4 thing, but it sounds so intricate and so chaotic when you're listening to it. It's wonderful. And then from there, the band just spills out into riff after riff, constantly, you know, shifting momentum, recontextualizing things, and it's a great little microcosm of the record as a whole. again, so much cool stuff happening in such a small period of time.
Oh, yeah.
And I find myself just really drawn to the way this band transitions between riffs. Like, almost like those transitions are somehow like the heart of these songs. It's not any individual riff, it's the texture of how they shift between them.
That's the grindcore thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, it's I mean, we both heard it like when they snap when they go back to kind of the intro triplet figure into that just neck snapping, fucking choppy thrash. You were calling it a D-beat riff, which is interesting. I didn't think of it as a D-beat
the thing
riff.
right at the end with the solo over it?
Yeah.
Well, they were just super sped up D-beats, and it was like a Sweet Death riff. They used a few of them on this record, but they're using them not in the Sweet Death ghetto, right? It was like the craziest dismember rhythm part. Like, he was playing chords that were like over an octave apart from each other on the fretboard or some shit. Like,
yeah, it's
just really
very weird.
Sounds sort of epic, but has really nasty chromaticisms in it. It was basically part of the solo.
Yeah, that crazy sort of just like all trem bar fucking noise solo. Yeah,
this is the thing. That's the thing. Like, it's all about the transitions and the sort of the ordering of things, but the riffs themselves are, I think, just consistently several cuts above par for this kind of thing. Like, the thrash riff there was just a straight ahead thrash riff at the beginning of that sample. Mm-hmm. That could have been on, like, I don't know, what's the one before Pleasure to Kill? Endless Pain?
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be better than some of the riffs on there, right? Mm-hmm. It's just like, it's kind of like I've been listening to Kill 'Em All again lately, and just like, shit, most of this record's great. But it's like, it's just like that, and they nail it, and then they're like, what do you think they're gonna do? Oh, they play one other standard thrash riff, and then they just hit the gravity blasts. It's hilarious, and there's no reason you can't do that, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And it's like, even after when they get into that other, like, more standard thrash riff, again, just, like, subtle dimensions of, like, okay, drumming. It's like, it's a pretty standard technique, so you've got this old school sort of, like, almost Scream Bloody Gore type primitive death thrash riff, and you've got the sort of pseudo DB going, and then it goes into just a crushing blast under the same riff. And then I love the way they flip into the final riff of this sample, high up on the neck intro of the riff, and when they go into the full version, they drop it down an octave, which is such a. It seems so small in the grand scheme of things, but it totally changes the context. It darkens the riff. You've got this kind of sprightly, again, Cryptopsy figure. I think Cryptopsy is probably like a primary thing going on this record, and then it drops down and it becomes. It's the same riff, just an octave lower, but the chromaticisms are brought out by that lower pitch. So I guess what I'm saying is, like you were saying, there are a lot of good riffs on this record, but I think what makes them really good is just not really a matter of note choice. It's entirely about, like, right hand work, sort of like inflection and tonal control over the guitar. A lot of these are stock riffs made extremely good by a very sophisticated guitarist.
Yeah, I get what you mean about it not being note choice per se. I think that's fair. He's very aware of the rhythmic. Yeah, like even that first thrash riff in the sample I did before, right, which had the skronky chords, right? In terms of the root notes there, that was a standard thrash riff.
It's well, I think it just goes to show just how important for sort of thrash style riffs a tremendous right hand is, because you can elevate a sort of standard figure from pretty good to great just by knowing how to dig into the chords and how to really play guitar in a way that's sort of been forgotten in a lot of extreme metal.
It's about timing, and it's not like I do think it's about note choice to some degree. It's just not about, like, you're not trying to give every riff its distinct melodic or harmonic idea. You just know where to put them. That's all. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, even if you just took the root notes of the thrash riffs or whatever, they're still, like, they sound way nastier than many things in similar scales do, and it's because they know where to put the notes. But that's just an obsession of mine. But I know what you mean about the rhythm thing, and I've become way more attentive to rhythm stuff through this show. I think they're talking about stuff with you.
Yeah.
So last sample. Speaking of rhythm, War Funeral March, obviously the last track. So if I just heard this sample, I'd assume these guys were Zoomers. So that is that thing that was at the beginning and end of the sample. That is the nowadays beatdown trudge. Right? That kind of like downbeat chug pattern, right? We've heard it in stuff we really like the Fluids. We've heard it in stuff that wasn't so good, like Terminal Nation. It's just all over very current beatdowny shit. And these guys, in many formats, it's not even a rhythm I like that much. It's like a particular articulation of this kind of super heavy thing that often the rhythm just doesn't land for me. These guys hit it out of the park. It just sounds, I don't even think, oh yeah, it's that trudge beat.
Well, it's what's really interesting, because listening to it again a little bit closer, I realize there's a ton of nuance to it that you don't hear from those other bands. Like,
exactly.
So for the other bands, when they're just doing the, just down picking kind of filler, open chord stuff.
Yeah.
Other bands just use the same chord the whole time. Melancholy Pessimism on that riff is using a descending chromatic figure every time they go back to that chug. There's a kind of counterpoint melodic dimension occurring, and it's a very simple, just like almost Mortician, like 4-3-2-1 thing.
It's a thrash thing. Like just da
da. And then, but it goes down a half step every time when it does that little slide down, with every repetition when they go back to the chugs. So it's like there's these really subtle things going on that again elevate these kind of stock figures way beyond what you would expect. Yeah,
and they also, the turnarounds there, you could hear them adding turnarounds as they repeated it, and at the end they were doing just like fast thrash leads as the turnaronors.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, it's really sophisticated. It's secretly sophisticated.
Any of these bands would do, right? Another thing they do is that the drumming is better there. They keep the they're not just doing like sort of like snare kick, right? They keep double bass rhythms going, and it's not constant double bass either.
Yeah, yeah. Also, one thing we were talking about, bring back the death metal stop-start riff.
Yeah. So to explain, we were talking about that part where they're doing a like a just kind of a racing thrash beat into a blast and back, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you've got that cool staggered, stop-start death metal riff with a bunch of negative space around it. And it's now, that's been kind of dismissed as like, oh, that's like a metalcore thing. But no, death metal bands have been doing that since the 90s.
Yeah, I mean, there's a variant of that becomes spazzy tech death shit. But I think what's crucial about this is that it doesn't really stop. It just moves abruptly between two rhythms and speeds.
Yeah.
And it does it in a sort of... It preserves momentum. It's just like... It's like taking a really wrenching turn in a vehicle or something. Without stopping. And it sets up this sort of... Well, this is an important thing in grind. We talked about this with... what was that? Really good, kind of more hardcore-sided band that it was, I think, from Australia. Internal Rot.
Yeah.
Yeah, Internal Rot has all these great kind of call and response things that work to sort of... They're not supposed to be the main... they're not, like, presenting, I don't know, all this jumbled, spazzy stuff as the main riff. Instead, they have these, like, clean, directed call and response kind of rapid change-up sequences that charge up and then release into some other riff. And that kind of thing is definitely, definitely more of that is needed in nowadays stuff. That's like specifically a thing a grind band can do really well, because it's supposed to grind. And we are back to review a record that we've put off for a couple months because, a record this big is relevant for the whole year, right? So this is Immolation's Acts of God on Nuclear Blast.
We get one or two a year, guys.
1 or 2 a year, yeah. It's always like the Ruins of Beverest and one other thing, right? This band, I feel like Immolation actually doesn't come up on the show that much because there are so few things that sound directly like them in modern death metal, right? However, they've been immensely influential on all sorts of like important aspects of technique that have been so internalized into various genres that I think their influence has been almost sort of memory hold. Most obvious example of that being, like, you couldn't have ulcerate without immolation, right? Mm-hmm. And so all this kind of, like, dissonant Black Death stuff that's so big now, most of it terrible, but seen as very cutting edge. A lot of this stuff is just messing, just changing little things about an idea that immolation perfected, decades ago. They're sort of like they're known as one of the most consistent bands in extreme metal at all, right? They've probably never released a bad record, and they've put out a ton of them, right? They've had a career long enough.
It's like a dozen albums or something at this point.
Yeah, and they've had a career long enough that they don't even rush it. So it's been 5 years since Atonement, and Atonement was 4 years since Kingdom of Conspiracy. But yeah, no, they have Dawn of Possession, Here and After, Failures for Gods, Close to World Below, Unholy Cult, Harnessing Ruin, Shadows in the Light, don't remember that one, Majesty and Decay, Kingdom of Conspiracy, Atonement, yeah, it's 11 or something. I might have miscounted, but you get it. Really, yeah. And, they're remarkably consistent, but there's different kinds of consistency, and I think we'll get into that a lot as we talk about them. They're a band that I wouldn't say I know them well enough as, say, like the Hessian Firm guys probably do, right? Like, if you're a certain kind of a death metal guy who's interested in the most sort of sophisticated and elegant aspects of the genre, right, you're going to be, like, obsessed with Immolation. But for a guy who mostly listens to black metal, I am, although that's somewhat changing these days, I am, which we can talk about more, but, for the black metal guy, right, I am fascinated with Immolation. And I think I for such a big discography, I actually think I know it pretty well. So, death metal guy, you've of course been familiar with them far longer than me, and everyone in your social milieu or whatever has opinions on this and where they stand in relation to the other greats in death metal. I know your feelings about Immolation. Why don't you tell the kids?
God, it's so fucking weird to talk about, because Immolation is, like, honestly one of the few bands in extreme metal these days where contrary opinions and hot takes just basically don't exist. Like, I feel like I'm the one person who's Immolation
ready, guys.
skeptical.
Here comes the death metal guy's contrary opinion.
No, not even. I wouldn't even say it's a particularly hot take. I think that Immolation, obviously, they're in the pantheon of the all-time greats. It's objectively very good music. Yada yada. Everybody's already made the case for Immolation better than I ever could. However, it's just never a band that I've really connected with on a personal level. And to try to figuring out the reasons for that would be like an episode unto itself. I've heard a lot of Immolation records.
Yeah. At its strictest, it'd be discovering something about your taste. But we can certainly try to focus on those things that matter for the rest of us about their sound that you just can't get into.
I think that Immolation, you have talked a lot about the idea of death metal bands doing black metal things. And I think that, in a sense, Immolation is almost the blueprint of that. Obviously, Immolation is a death metal band, but I think a lot of what makes them unique and a lot of their success comes down to being a band that is clearly death metal in style, but ultimately reaching toward, in a large part, things that black metal does. High emphasis on texture and harmonic dimension, high emphasis on atmosphere, a kind of generally epic quality in its own sense, a sort of more open, diffuse, but not necessarily in a bad way, sort of arrangement of the instruments. In short,
right, they're not all concentrated around the center to deliver a brick of heaviness.
Yeah. In general, listening to Immolation, especially some of their most seminal stuff, like Close to a World Below, feels to me more like listening to a black metal record in its sort of openness, its sort of wafting quality, than it does listening to a, meat and potatoes death metal record. And that is one of the defining features of Immolation. That's one of the things that's made them so successful and so influential. And that's the thing, is like, I can't even shit on the influence of Immolation because obviously it's great. It's just, for me personally, I guess it's just a case, I feel like I've been saying this a lot, but it's like, it's a band reaching toward things in death metal that I'm just not really into death metal for. Immolation is not a band particularly concerned with, at least my vision of, like, brutality and my understanding of heaviness and extremity. It is all of those things in its own way, just not in the manners that I am most interested in as a listener.
Death metal guy, I'm going to pitch you a crazy idea.
Okay.
That we will keep in the back, that I don't think we can address right now, but... Do you think Immolation was a central influence on slam?
I mean, I don't know, maybe to
obviously suffocation. There are things that are way more immediately proximate. But think about, like, the stuff you like that's the most far out, like cephalotripsy or whatever, right?
Yeah, no, definitely.
The idea that you structure an entire song based around these rolling, sort of strangely shaped mid-tempo figures that aren't really breakdowns, that have their own kind of internal, slow, convulsive momentum, and are sort of, like, heavily rhythmically punctuated. It's a little bit like this sort of lattice work of slams you speak of.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I mean, obviously, Immolation is coming from the New York scene, so they're immediately contemporary to some of the biggest roots of the slam scene. And I definitely get the idea that you're getting at, that there is a sort of, like, a sort of reflective structural similarity there. But I guess I would say the difference for me really comes down to maybe something as sort of reductive and simple as, like, tone.
Yeah.
Immolation is very wide and open and not really maybe it's too smart in a way, you know?
Yeah, no, I get that. Yeah, you want death metal to be very, especially New York style stuff to be, well, that's the thing we've talked about, right? With death metal, you're into, I mean, we converge on a certain kind of stupid death metal, right? A stupid, smart death metal, like Sluggathor, right?
Yeah.
Which we, talked a lot about last episode, or Bolt Thrower, or whatever. Stuff that is just powerfully physical in that way, right? But there's another kind of death metal that just sounds like a sort of hostile and supermassive substance that is sort of not on the periodic spectrum.
Here we go.
And that's the slam stuff, right? And Immolation is...
Immolation sounds like an environment where acts would take place. I'm more interested in the ones that are about the acts taking place. You know what I mean? Immolation is an incredibly detailed and magnificently executed landscape painting of a death metal band. But I am the guy that wants to hone in on the figures, the tiny figures dotting that landscape, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I definitely see black metal as usually
this is the most pretentious thing I've ever fucking said on the show.
No, nowhere near, dude. Nowhere near. But the I feel like most of the black metal that really interests me is also very action-oriented, but I hear what you mean in that it also projects a sonic space or atmosphere, right?
Paradoxically, I think I'm more interested in kind of the landscapey black metal. That's the distinction between the two of us. What makes me the death metal guy and you the black metal guy is that we seek very different things from the styles. We've talked about this in fits and starts over the years.
So, well, I've told you that, aside from death metal that works like hardcore or literally like black metal, right? The other death of the classic death metal bands that's compared to, black metal is Morbid Angel, right? Mm-hmm. But that's less a matter of comparison because Morbid Angel just works like black metal in a lot of ways, sort of repetitive tremolo riffing, sort of, sinister nobility, very earnest Satanism.
It's got a very black metal atmosphere, definitely.
Yeah, and it just directly influenced the second wave, right? Mm-hmm. It's so the, whereas Immolation, the other Asian band, is, Immolation is very specifically death metal.
Yes.
But kind of we've talked about, doing purely in death metal specific vocabulary, what you can do in black metal. And so that there's two different ways of being related to BM. And, I hear what you mean about the environments. I feel like Immolation is often suffocatingly dense. Like Close to a World Below is crushingly dense, but I get that it's kind of a density of texture and rhythm. Mm-hmm. It's the way that all these figures are just sort of stacking on each other and just...
Immolation is dense. Immolation is dense and heavy in the way that Aosoth is dense and heavy.
Yeah. Oh, it's exactly that. I was thinking about Aosoth a lot when I was listening to this record. I think Aosoth is massively influenced by Immolation and a lot of Orthodox stuff.
I would say that Immolation is probably the primary death metal influence on Orthodox black metal.
Yeah, so we'll get to that with some of the samples. But yeah, that's a great point. Great minds, death metal guy. Great minds.
But let's hone in though on this record in particular and where it fits into the discography, because both you and I. So something that's important to note is, and this is, I think, an idea that's only sincerely congealed in the zeitgeist, so to speak, over the past few years, which is the idea that Immolation, okay, very consistent band. However, there is a turning point that occurs with Harnessing Ruin in 2005, where the music retains all of its unique qualities but becomes distinctly more streamlined, shorter songs, more compact and kind of punchy. You can kind of divide the discography into two halves there. And Acts of God definitely fits within that milieu. But as you wrote in the notes, it's sort of like they're taking different takes on that thing with every new record, which I agree with.
Yeah. If you wanted to periodize it, it's something like, you've got the initial phase where it's identifiably kind of New York death metal, just of a particularly dark and black metal adjacent variety, and just strange variety, right? So you got, sort of the stuff that has the early 90s, the 90s era mystique, right? So you got like Here and After would be representative for that, right? Then you get stuff that just develops certain tendencies of this to make the most strange refinement and intensification of everything that makes them Immolation, right? So you end up with like Close to a World Below, right? That's their Panzer Division Marduk or whatever, right?
And then before all that, you have Dawn of Possession, which is like a New York take on just Ultras of Madness, which is I actually love Dawn of Possession.
That's what I'm saying. That's just a death metal record. It doesn't have it doesn't have like the sound quite yet.
Yeah,
right? They go into the shed for 5 years and come out with Here and After. And so they sort of develop the weirdest tendencies in that further and further to Close to a World Below. That's another turning point. And then quickly again, they pivot in 2005 to Harnessing Ruin, right? And at that point, I think there is another one of the big albums. And since then, everything they've done has been a different version of what Immolation but stripped down and direct might mean. So on Harnessing Ruin, I that one is so cool.
I really like that record. It is a very good record.
I feel like that should be like what regular black death metal sounds like right now.
Oh yeah, agreed. It's definitely. I mean, it kind of scoops. It's moving in parallel to moves that like Behemoth were doing with Demigod, like around the same time period. You know,
you could hear it was responsive to Behemoth and Nile, but in a very, just way better.
Oh yeah.
Still with all of the sophisticated chording, and with these really long, not meaningless snake charmer melodies, but like really lengthy melodies. And in terms of a record by Immolation that actually sounds like black metal, that's it. But not
that's
like,
interesting.
but
Yeah.
not like, obviously not like Candelabra black metal.
Yeah,
that sounds specifically kind of like just sort of war metal and arrogant thrash stuff. It feels kind of like an Ares Kingdom or Angel Corpse record. You can almost get the sense that like Vigno was like listening to Iron Maiden before they recorded it. It's the only one that has folk riffs. Very strange, vicious folk riffs,
and
like
solos that operate like solos are supposed to in metal songs. Yeah.
Or even
yeah, and
Ross Dolan's vocals often have this sort of ominous, solemn kind of. It's like a litany of accusation.
Yeah.
Right? Very
well, I mean,
often.
Harnessing Ruin is like their heavy metal album.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It's super heavy metal, and it's heavy metal in the way that like some of the most manly black metal is, right?
Yeah.
The vocals, as opposed to this sort of solemn, like funereal presence that he often has. In Harnessing Ruin, he's just like yelling shit that sounds cool.
Yeah, in the production, he's way up front. He's a lot more just kind of shouty than he typically is.
Yeah, it doesn't have this sort of close to a world below it. It's up front, but it's kind of tortured, and they almost have this uncomfortable immediacy to them that a wise man once pointed out makes them read kind of like nu metal lyrics inadvertently.
Well, he's Ross's vocals have always been interesting. They've always felt a little like quiet or a little bit more purring. I don't know.
It's part of the textural thing. Right?
No, it's cool. I like his style.
Yeah.
It's just.
But in
it's
Close
distinct.
to World Below, they're a little more foregrounded, and they're a little more sort of accusatory IU, which you couldn't have the record without it. And the general atmosphere of accusation is something we'll come back to. That's like fundamental to Immolation. But like Harness and Ruin, he's just like yelling badass shit. Right?
Yeah.
That's the album where he just is like, what's his name, Murderface or whatever. The guy from fucking
from Death Clock, yeah.
Right?
Well, yeah, it's like the title track is like a soulless machine that hunkers toward victory or something. It's that's fucking sick. I love that.
yeah. So so like what? So like after that, right? I don't know Shadows. I don't really know Majesty and Decay. Or Kingdom of Conspiracy, I think. Majesty and Decay, I think, was a slower one. Correct me if I'm wrong. Kingdom of Conspiracy was more like just down the line blasty. Atonement was fascinating, and that's what really got me hooked on Immolation.
You see, Atonement's one of the ones I actually haven't heard. So.
Dude, you'd like it. The thing is, like, so this version of more immediate Immolation is like warm guitar tone, almost like they're using like a classic rock tone or like orange amps, like but like not good, like really kind of so it's like warmer and fuzzier, but in a way that just really sort of lets the textures blend across each other in a way that you normally wouldn't get. And they're pop songs, like they wrote them to be extremely hook focused. Not in the kind of, here's the big riff motherfucker way on Harnessing Ruin.
Yeah.
But like, which is more just like assault of massive riffs. But this is, each part is clearly demarked, and they all work to push the big riffs into the forefront. And the big riffs are extremely memorable on Atonement. But they're also extremely strange and slidey, and they kind of have this sort of, Nyarlathotep Oriental Lovecraft majesty to them.
Yeah, it's Vigna. Yeah, I mean, it's the only way he plays guitar. Yeah.
No. In other records, it sounds colder or more chromatic.
Well, yeah, there's range within his style, but it's always unmistakably him. Yeah.
For sure. Yes, he's got a style that he refines and hones and a discipline on each record.
Oh, yeah, I played with them one time, and all I did was watch Vigna on guitar. His guitar style is so fascinating, the way he plays. It's very unlike any other death metal guitarist.
So some of those specific qualities are really brought to the fore there, because you can hear the inflection in his playing, just the smearing and bending and... Yeah,
he's got the Hendrixian quality of old school death metal players.
That's a good point. Yeah,
guitar guys. Back when death metal had guitar guys.
Yeah, he's very tightly disciplined, but he's a soulful player in a weird way. There's a lot of inflection and personality in it. So Atonement is a really interesting record. It's sort of poppy and apocalyptic, and it has one song called "When the Jackals Come" that is just like extraordinarily memorable, and it actually has just a straight up BM Trem riff in it.
Okay.
Like almost like not even like the kind you would associate with Immolation. It's almost like a Graveland riff.
No, I'll check it out.
Yeah.
I mean,
and Acts of God. So that comes after Atonement. Atonement feels mostly slow. With like the big riffs are often blasted, but slow blasted. I get the sense that Acts of God is like, okay, now we're going to do a really brutal one. I'm sure in the studio they said brutal. We're going to do a brutal one, and it's going to be extremely dense. We are not going to have hooks. It's going to be pure just core rhythm riffage structuring the record, and of course the solos. And the game here, where the game on the last one was to write pop songs, the game on this one is to make a old school album length, real album, right? This is upwards of 50 minutes. And to make it almost entirely out of 3-minute songs. The two that are there's 1.5 and 2 that are just over 4. And so this is a really long album out of this that's made out of basically like 3 hardcore records.
Yeah.
So it's just like, maybe they're kind of doing Immolation's Rain and Blood, except it's slow.
Yeah, there's a lot of songs on this record. There's 15 tracks. So overall, to get back to Acts of God specifically, now that we've done...
I was talking about it. I was talking about Acts of God.
Well, yeah, no, but for me.
All right, eventually we'll play the samples, but there's a lot to say about
it's fucking Immolation. Yeah, I mean, it's like when we were talking about the Chasm. It's like whenever we do this, it's like, okay, we're doing kind of a referendum on the band.
We got to tell them what we think about the band, and then where the album is, and then finally we'll listen to the fucking band.
Right. So I definitely agree that this is extremely direct. This is trying to be a death metal, a capital D, capital M death metal record in a way that maybe they haven't in a few records now.
They might not have, in a sense, since the 90s. I think this sounds more 90s than Harnessing Ruin.
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, it's like, I feel like this reaches back... obviously, it's still got the core of the kind of redefined Immolation sound of Harnessing Ruin, but maybe even punchier. I think that, in general, this is a record on the faster side in terms of their later discography. And it feels like kind of the oldest stuff, like the Dawn of Possession kind of death thrash stuff, is creeping back in fits and starts. Like, there's distinctly... I mean, Immolation and Morbid Angel have always kind of sounded like each other in important ways. Specifically just in terms of guitar technique and shit like that. Here, that's pretty distinct. There's a lot of parts of this that really remind me of, like, Gateways to Annihilation by Morbid Angel. However, Gateways is a record of, like, 6-minute songs, and this is a record of 3-minute songs. So, naturally, the focus is different as a result. overall, I like this. I like to listening to it. I can't say that it changes my overall impression of Immolation style, but I do like the idea of them maybe pulling back on the abstraction a little bit and making something more, I guess, just more concrete in a way for me.
This has parts where you're like, that is just a death metal riff.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. There's no added.
There's riffs there are power chord riffs on here,
and there's direct trem riffs. So should we actually listen to songs, or should we just skip all the samples and we just kind of riff? That's it, guys. Yeah, let's listen to some songs. Let's listen to songs. Okay, so I think this is a record where, I mean, again, this is a long album. This is over 50 minutes, and we got 15 tracks. I feel like it's about a third of the way through where things really start to congeal. I mean, I
completely agree with you.
These are all songs that kind of sound the same in the sense that death metal should. It is made of a homogeneous material. There are, songwriting conceits that repeat. Like, I always feel the need to clarify that. Everything sounding the same, that's how extreme metal's supposed to be.
It's all supposed to sound the same. There are rare exceptions to this rule, right?
In general, it should all sound the same. But I do think
and if you want to be the exception to that rule, you have to understand the rule.
Yes, exactly. You got to know it to break it. But I do think, and it might have to do with like the shortness of the tracks, I think it's a little bit difficult to get in the mood immediately, kind of from the onset of this record, because you've got these very short, kind of punchy tracks. It takes a little bit for you to settle into it. But then we get to Overtures of the Wicked, which I believe is like a pretty popular song off this record. I think it's kind of like one of the pseudo-single tracks off of it. And here we're just going to listen to Vigna do some really cool shit. You've got a wonderful thing, a technique that I think is super underutilized, the idea of a solo continuing over multiple unique riffs. Not even just an A-B trade. There is a full sequence of riffs occurring under the solo, which are given equal weight in terms of musical importance. And you're going to hear just the blending of a lot of techniques throughout Immolation's career. You're going to have rhythmic ideas that are very close to A World Below. You're still going to have the melodic center from the post-harnessing ruin stuff. But it definitely points to a direction of, I think, the band trying to almost sort of like recenter themselves, be like, we've learned so many lessons over the past 15 years. How do we start congealing this into a new foundation to expand from yet again? It's very interesting to listen to Immolation these days, especially with songs so short. Because it feels to me like they really tried to maintain the sort of density and structural complexity of stuff like Close to a World Below, but compressed down to such a short time frame. I go back and forth. It's like, maybe do these things need more breathing room, more space for repetition? But I also really like the aggressive juxtaposition of these different ideas. I like that it's challenging.
It'll repeat again 3 tracks from now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it won't be the exact same riff, but they have like, maybe. I don't know. It's Immolation, so they have a lot of different riff types. But if there's a type of riff you like in one spot, you will hear it again.
Mm-hmm. So for that in particular, love the whole passage with that first solo over that series of riffs and contrasting rhythmic ideas. One thing that I love from Immolation is that they do real tempo changes. They don't just fake their way through with just like cut time and double time stuff. There's actual, non-metric, so to speak, tempo changes, which is something you hear in that really distinctly between passages. I really like that. Really like the one thing that I appreciate about Immolation that their imitators don't understand is Immolation still knows how to do cool death metal things. Like when the slow tom beat comes in, Ross knows that the opening line should feature the word conquering. It's like
yeah.
Ross doesn't talk about, fucking math and shit. He talks about hating Jesus and the apocalypse and stuff. It's like that's the kind of thing death metal's supposed to be about. Sorry, guys. Sorry, Blood Incantation. It's not in the cards for you. But yeah, so I guess this is kind of a good microcosm of the whole record. It's like you've got a real blend of ideas. It's like definitely, I like what you said about the idea of Immolation circa Harnessing Ruin just being responsive to stuff like Nile and Behemoth. Like, why would you not respond to that? There's some of the biggest death metal bands in the world, and so is Immolation. Why would you not take lessons from each other? And they managed to do that, managed to sort of create, in a sense, especially on Harnessing Ruin, sort of pop death metal songs that still featured all of the most crucial aspects that made Immolation unique. And it's been very interesting, even as a guy that isn't like a huge Immolation fan, to watch them refine and iterate on that concept over the past decade and a half.
I think this one and Atonement for sure sound more like Close to a World Below in terms of the riffing style and tempo than they sound to Harnessing Ruin. That's an important thing to clarify. Harnessing Ruin is blasty and like fast and has these really long riffs that repeat for a long time. That's a thing that makes it black metal-y.
Well, they also just Harnessing Ruin also has like
sort of
bolt thrower riffs,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sure. Yeah, like it's just got long, heavily repeated, massive riffs. So Atonement and Acts of God are direct in the way that it's like they have a couple different vocabularies they can use, and like that's what I meant about the different modes of directness thing after that one. It's like these last 2 records have a vocabulary that I feel like is closer to their sort of solemn mid-tempo comfort zone. But I wouldn't even really call it comfort zone. They can play fucking fast, right? It just,
but Immolation's fast parts always feel kind of mid-tempo.
Yeah, I think the exception to that would be on like Harnessing Ruin or maybe certain parts of the early stuff. Also, I mean, I think Kingdom of Conspiracy was quite sort of like Behemoth blasty. I remember.
Yeah.
But sort of in terms of the signature thing of this rolling, slowly accumulating mid-tempo kind of crush, this is this draws heavily on the Close to World Below thing. It's just not like the songs aren't as long, they're not as intricate, they're not as and they have more clearly defined sort of riff centers.
Yeah, close. I would
It's
say
not like
that
Close to a World Below is just like this convulsing. It's just hell.
close to a World Below is still the I think the apex of Immolation in terms of just like sheer complexity and
complexity,
difficulty,
intensity, difficulty. Yeah, it's their "fuck you" album. It's the yeah. That's why I said like Panzer Division Marduk or whatever, right? It's the one that's uncompromisingly them.
It's the definitive statement of the band. It's always going to be.
Yeah. It's but yeah. So this has. Yeah, I think in terms of our samples, this was a good one to start with because it highlights, the classic, the new take on the signature sound. There were a few other things you said when it started. You were like, "Oh, of course I chose the one with a slam."
Yeah. It's got that very just like knuckle dragging kind of Baphomet riff.
There are knuckle dragging riffs throughout this, and the funny thing is that the slam intensifies as the vocals come in. Like they do another chug riff. Another thing I wanted to point out on this, which I think was really clear in the last riff, with that like slow descending. I feel like Immolation is heavily Doom influenced.
No, I'd agree. Yeah,
like there's a sad melody there, and the lyrics, right? Coming back to that sort of accusatory thing. You've talked about certain bands in death and black metal sort of being inadvertently Catholic.
Yeah. Well, for that statement, for Immolation in particular, I have to give tribute to that legendary Metal Archives reviewer, Jesus Priest, who is the first one who kind of brought that up in my mind. He mentioned that it wasn't in a review of Immolation, it was in a review of somebody else, but he had mentioned offhandedly there's something about Immolation that suggests that, Immolation's whole standpoint has been very interesting, in terms of anti-Christianity, and that, as opposed to something like Deicide, which is a sort of like petulant rejection of Christianity, it's like Immolation are like sad that it's not true. Yeah,
I think something like that, and they're that in good faith.
Yeah.
Right? They know exactly what they're doing.
Immolation aren't mad; they're just disappointed.
No, they're very mad. They are.
It's a bit.
No. I mean, I think mostly what they're mad at is like pedophile priests.
Oh yeah.
I think I feel like a lot of these lyrics are directed towards not just to that, but to. There's a kind of they're Jeremiads or diatribes against like rot and moral corruption. There was that that sort of like map of the development of the ethos in death and black metal that fucking DMU Brett did back in the day when it was Amos, right?
Yeah, Prozac.
And although there's all sorts of things we can say we don't agree with about that, it really is pretty damn good model of just different kinds of positions that people took as the music developed. And he pointed out that for a minute there was like, you'd get these lyrics that dealt more with like accusations of Christian hypocrisy, right? In sort of in the way that some kinds of punk lyrics are, right?
Yeah.
Maybe less direct, the punk lyrics directly embrace Christian morality. Maybe not so much some of these death metal lyrics. They're just like, you are a hypocrite, right? But there's that tradition survives in Immolation. And I feel like they are Catholics for whom God has died and for whom the church has died.
Yeah.
And they are bitterly angry, and they look around and they just see this sort of desolate fallen world.
Yeah, Immolation's whole thing has never been like disagreement with the purported moral center of Christianity. It's been its failure to actualize in reality.
Yeah. So lyrics on this track, in terms of like this sort of, we've talked about how like if there's a generic outlet for Christianity in metal, right? It's like probably Doom.
Yeah.
And the coolest variant of that is this intensely medieval Catholicism that you get in, like, Messiah Marcolin or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like Reverend Bizarre. And so here you get lyrics like, wickedness will overcome us in this track. Like, that's a doom lyric, and that is a sort of medieval flagellant lyric.
Yeah.
It's very, so that's a characteristic part of their mood that we should talk about. And I think they're playing up doom death throughout this, both of the New York variety and the British variety. So now we all know when we talk about the New York variety, we all know we're referring to one band. When Halos Burn is my next one. So we're doing the tracks out of order, by the way. I think it just makes more sense this way. This one's towards the end of the record. And it's in the middle of a distinct suite of 3 songs that goes from Derelict of Spirit to When Halos Burn to Let the Darkness In. And then there are only 2 more tracks on the record. They're all kind of like similar in length, and they're and similar in gesture. And there's this kind of ratcheting up of intensity. So here you're going to hear the way that Immolation is reincorporating shit that the Orthodox bands took from them. Yeah, I would listen to that. Listen to the resonance with Orthodox black metal. I mean, especially stuff like Aesoth, but really all of it. So you could hear it, right?
Oh, yeah, it's like the first riff. The first riff of the sample, yeah.
Yeah, you get this sort of a simple blast riff with those clustered dissonant chords. And then later, in a more subtle way, they do a triplet blast. Like, I have a clearly spaced triplet blast that is very black metal.
Well, that is interesting. Is that technology specifically derived from Immolation, or is it like kind of parallel? That's an interesting topic in and of itself.
Oh no, I think the triplet blasting is that's fundamental black metal technique. Right?
Oh no, I mean more in the harmonic ideas.
The skronky chords. Yeah, I mean, well, I think in terms of some of it is just like carrying certain aspects of Mayhem further, right? Like Offermod was not listening to Immolation, I don't think. And in terms of the orthodox stuff, I'm sure fucking the dude from DSO was listening to Immolation.
Oh yeah, certainly. Yeah, I think Aosoth is definitely listening to Immolation.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean that's. I listened to that Aosoth record again today. My God, that is fucking good.
What, Arrow and Heart? Yeah.
Arrow and Heart, yeah.
Yeah,
the one after it is probably incredible, too. I just have never listened to it.
I've listened to the one after it. It's very good, but Arrow and Heart is forever that band. It's that band's Close to a World Below, That's it. It's Arrow and Heart, dude. But anyway, so, no, yeah, this is definitely, I did notice there is a sort of sequence of more blasting, more distinctly aggressive tracks toward the end.
Yeah, exactly. And now we're going to go to two samples, mine is from the very end, Apostle. Yours is just...
Right in the middle, yeah.
Incineration Procession, right? We're going to go to yours next. This, we both agree, is like probably the best track on the record.
Yeah, and it's weird because people don't really... I haven't seen a lot of people talk about this song, but I think it's like just far and away the best one.
I think most people stop listening after the middle.
Well, that's a bad decision because I think this is a record that picks up substantially.
I completely agree.
Yeah, we've talked about that already.
Say a sad thing about people's listening habits, but like... Of course.
I think it's
when you're listening to something on your commute, and another thing where you are ostensibly getting paid to do it on a podcast.
Well, I think it's something I kind of respect about this record. I'm not sure if it's like, in my own idealized mind, the best way to do it, but I like the idea of, okay, so Immolation is doing their version of like the middle of Rain and Blood. Here's a bunch of shorter tracks that sound on the surface very similar to one another, and you have to dig out the idiosyncrasies and the things that make these individual songs special. So Incineration Procession, the 9th track, easily my favorite on the record, and it's because it's the one that sort of, in a sense, breaks out from the traditional Immolation riffing style the most. That's not to complain about Immolation's riffing style. Obviously, it's iconic, and, Vigna is one of the greatest death metal guitarists of all time. However, after 12 albums, you're gonna have to break out. It's like the greatest.
We agree.
The greatest guitarist in human history is not going to be able to do 12 full-length albums of shit that is.
Imagine how bad the 12th Jimi Hendrix album would have been.
Yeah, exactly. It's like that's why you're supposed to die when you're 27.
Immolations, Vigna's got him there.
So here he breaks out and he does stuff that is more kind of traditionally melodic, in a way that is not super familiar to earlier Immolation work. Stuff that is like accessing sort of melodic Black Death ideas that I haven't really heard these explored before on Immolation, which is not to say that I think Immolation should move toward the center, but I think the incorporation of these ideas for big dramatic peaks is a really cool new development for the band. And this, this section of the song, this sort of like ending half is, I think, kind of the climax of the album. So yeah, I think it was like I was saying, it's like it's always been challenging for me to develop a sort of like immediate emotional connection with Immolation. This is a part that's like really emotionally resonant to me, and that could just me being a fucking normie, picking the part with like sort of the big obvious riff. But it is the reason it works as sort of far away from the traditional Immolation riffing style as it is that there's been 8 tracks of preparation for it. It's this cathartic, emotional collapse at the end of this song. And one thing that I was thinking of, sort of echoing the idea of, Immolation being, in some sense, like in part a doom band, is like that big melodic trem riff. If you break that down, it's just like kind of plaintive single notes or chords. You have like a Candlemas or like a Warning riff there. Yeah. That's just pure, just epic heavy metal Dorian scale stuff there.
Sad.
And and I think that's what I like about it. Is like this sounds kind of weird, but it's like Immolation in a sense. It's like, oh, this is one of the rare moments I've heard like vulnerability from Immolation.
That's a good point.
It's just fucking sad. It's there is
Yeah, that's been an undertone. I mean, certainly like the gloom and sense of disappointment and whatever has always been present, but it's usually been much more of this sort of accusation of the world, right?
Paradoxically righteous anger,
Yeah, no, yeah, for sure. Not in a dumb way, right? But it's And here, the melancholy has always been sort of the unspoken thing. And here it's very spoken. I think that's a very good point. It's not the only time. So what else can you say about that riff? I mean, if you want to think about what that riff sounds like, right, it's like the most noble Swedish Black Death, or whatever, right?
Yeah.
However, and there's thankfully more and more bands that are starting to draw on that tradition. However, who do you think can actually play like those guys? Vigna, right?
Yeah.
And he can put his own inflection on it, right? The way this is delicately phrased and has that sort of da-da-da, it has that staccato thing at the end, right? Different from sort of streaming trem. That's entirely him.
Yeah. And there's also just like the unique rhythmic sense of Immolation, which
that's what I mean. Yeah, the timing and the phrasing on that riff.
Yeah. I mean, that's always been a crucial part of Vigna's guitar style. Is he never wants the notes to land where you expect them to. Actually, that riff in particular is a much more straightforward one than he usually does. But it also has to do with Immolation's drumming style. And of course, the drumming is phenomenal on this. It's been phenomenal on every Immolation record. And that's sort of, it's interesting because the drumming on Immolation records has always sort of echoed that undercurrent of sadness. It always feels like it's falling apart. It's there's a sense of like there's power behind it, but there's a way that Immolation parts of songs tend to sort of dissolve and collapse, at the end of things.
It's very melodic drumming. Also.
It's extremely musical.
In terms of being sad and musical, maybe not falling apart, but in terms of sad and musical, it's like Joy Division.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I could definitely...
Executed at, like a gigavolt greater technical ability, but...
Yeah, you can definitely go, like, full fucking rock music critic and find the ways that, like, this connects to Orchid, But also, just in terms of, like, open sadness, what are we reflecting? Well, we're reflecting, like, one of the most important tracks on, like, Close to a World Below, Father, You're Not a Father. Like, that is, to me, one of the most important songs on that record, and possibly in Immolation's career, which is another place of, like, unusual vulnerability, I think. It's interesting to see them access that, I guess.
Yeah. Well, speaking of things like that, or rather, speaking of precedent for that riff and of strangely timed, sort of majestic, strangely timed trem riffs, they actually have always had those in their back pocket, right? So this isn't the first time they've used direct Dorian melody, right? They also have that. That is all over Harnessing Ruin, although often sort of like part of the riff will sound like that or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's all over Harnessing Ruin. They really have things that sound like Maiden riffs. And actually, like, the biggest riff on Dawn of Possession is like that. And the key thing is, in 1996, or not Dawn of Possession, sorry, Here and After. In 1996, right, that's directly simultaneous with Swedish Black Death. The biggest riff is on, like, Nailed to Gold. It's not really sad. It's more sort of... It's actually a more noble or martial sounding riff, but it's strange and muddled, and, you know, it sounds like it's being made in hell. And it's shaped in a really odd way where I can't tell if each of the notes is hanging over slightly where we expect it to be in the bar, or if it's in pure inflection. You know, some of our listeners will know exactly what riff I'm talking about, but it's this gigantic trem riff, and that just gigantic murky trem riff that comes out of nowhere, and they never really play anything like it again in the record. And this riff is very similar in spirit to that one, although less sort of weird and aggressive sounding and more sort of sad. And you could play this riff on Incineration Procession. You could play that riff on flamenco guitar.
I think you could probably say that about a lot of Immolation stuff in general.
Yeah.
You can play all their stuff.
True.
You can play Immolation on classical guitar or piano, and it gives the same quality, you know.
This is one of the few bands I would actually trust to do a record of jazz covers. Like, completely, they'd have to completely rewrite. You know, you give them license to, like, change every interval so it, you know, sounds cool. But, like, you know, I'd love to hear their version of A Love Supreme or whatever, right? But
yeah.
Yeah. A love not supreme. Let's go to oh yeah, and I wanted to point out, speaking of those lyrics, another thing like that. Before the blast, the lyric is something, he says, innocence something, shame on your soul. So again, this sort of like righteous rage. Let's go to Apostle. Last track. Basically everything that's cool about this is also, there are things like it also in Incineration. So you can hear on the back end of the record some relatively consistent stylistic gestures being developed. Let's check it out.
Okay, well, the trem... I actually fucked up the timing on that sample, but it doesn't matter. The trem riff that comes in right where I stop the sample is, like, phenomenal, but you'll have to listen to the record to hear it. That's a very Immolation riff. The trem riff is very Immolation, but also very black metal. You can listen to the record for that. But the real thing I want to talk about there is just the fucking chug. All right? That is... Oh, I actually totally fucked up the sample there. Oh well, doesn't matter. We've said so much shit. No, I had something more to say about the sample, but it doesn't matter. The big chug riff there sounds a lot like Winter, and I think it might even be almost note for note like kind of the riff on the Shreds of Sanity by Bolt Thrower. Throughout the record, they just play these throwdown riffs, and I haven't heard them ever do anything like that, even on Here and After, something like that. It's colossal.
I think that people have the tendency to forget the New York origins of Immolation. I was hanging out with Ross at a show I was playing with them one time. We talked a little bit back and forth, and I definitely got the sense from the guy that he is more of a, despite the like supernatural complexity of his music, that he is much more of a down-to-earth death metal guy than a lot of people might initially think. There's sort of like when you were talking about watching Interviews with Skepticism, the realization that these guys really are just like fucking metalheads at their core, despite the abstraction of their music.
Yeah, and so that's I think a good way to bring it around to some of the bigger question stuff. To wrap this up, it's like, the thing about Immolation have always been like it's a very there's like definitely a working class spirit to the band for sure, even just in terms of their persistence and their sort of dedication. But they So I guess the question really is, where to now, right? And this gets back to that thing that, a thing you were saying in the notes that I thought was very smart. There's a substantial contrast in this music between the abstract textural harmonic ideas and weird rhythms and time signatures versus their insertion into relatively straightforward death metal song structures, right? And now, compared to black metal, these have always been very complicated songs. But especially in this latter phase of Immolation, they very consciously worked to make sure, no matter what they're doing rhythmically or harmonically, it's always overall working like a just dense riff-driven death metal song. And that there's something really admirable about that. I think even by 96, when they were recording their really signature record, right, they'd listen to everyone else just like hit the wank pedal, right?
Yeah.
Or start writing pop heavy metal or whatever. They're like, we want none of that. And so what path is available at that time? It's like, well, you write this really sort of involved music, but you remain firmly dedicated to writing death metal songs. And that's one thing that's allowed their kind of, allowed them to be consistent in a way that Motorhead was not, in a way that Bathory was not. But it does mean that, like, the last, there is profound artistic vision behind Immolation, but the artistic vision coalesced in the 90s, right? And there have been maybe one or two major pivots since then, right, around Harnessing Ruin, and, maybe you could also identify Close to a World Below as a pretty significant step in the vision. But, like, for the last while, they've had a clearly defined vision, and it's almost shifted from art music to craftsman's music, as you would say. Like, a lot of what they do is refined crafting of the vision that already exists. So what interests me is, like, where this band is still capable. This band is capable of another big breakthrough. Absolutely. Where do you think they would take it? Or should?
What if they just did a Doom record?
We'll get to put on our Facebook headsets and have furry sex on the virtual moon.
I mean, that's pretty tight too, but